Hey guys, this is Anthony Morganti from anthonymorganti.com. This is episode 1 of the Photography is My Passion podcast. And in this episode, we're going to talk about the photographer's phases of growth. Now, as I said, this is episode 1 of what I hope will be a weekly podcast where we'll be talking about all things photography. One week we might talk about wedding photography, the next week we'll talk about landscape photography, and so on. And my hope is this podcast will grow to the point where I could have guests on the show, either via Skype or maybe they could come up here to my studio in downtown Buffalo. Now, for this, the first episode, we're going to talk about an article I did on my website a couple weeks ago that was very well received. I called it The Photographer's Phases of Growth. And you're probably wondering, why is this important? Why do you need to know the phases of growth? Well, probably the most important reason is quite often I see a person just gets their first camera and they expect to go out and take pictures like Ansel Adams. And they really quickly become discouraged, and most often the camera just ends up in their closet collecting dust. So it's important to know that you're not going to be taking award-winning pictures, most likely, at least, when you first start out. Another reason is sometimes people get very good very quickly, and all their family and friends are telling them how good their pictures are, so they decide to turn pro. Unfortunately, they're good, but they're not really good enough to be a professional, and they kind of wallow in their own mediocrity. So it's important to know what the phases of growth are so you know when you're ready to turn pro, if you so choose, if that's your aspiration. Now, I had a question from someone, and they're asking me why I call it phases and not stages. Well, I didn't call it stages because stage implies that you have to completely finish one stage before you move on to the next stage. And that's not true in this case. You could be in phase 1, but you could be dabbling in something that the phase 2 or phase 3 photographer does. So it's kind of a little more esoteric here. It's not written in stone where you are in the phases and what you're specifically doing. But let's go over them and you'll get an idea what I'm talking about. Phase 1 I call the technician. I mean, you just got that brand new camera and it has all these controls and menus on them, and you're wondering what aperture is, shutter speed, ISO, focus modes, exposure compensation, and so on. And not only do you have to know what all those terms actually mean, you have to know how to implement them on your camera and why you need to implement them at certain times. And you're very technical now. This is a very technical part of your upbringing as a photographer. So you have to know these terms and understand what happens when you use, let's say, a wide aperture compared to a narrow aperture, how it affects the scene. And then you have to know how to set that up on your camera as well. So it's a very important thing. What I think is the most important phase, because everything else is going to be built upon the foundation you learn as a technician. So if you're out and you're in phase 2 or 3 and you really don't know your camera's functions very well and you don't understand, let's say, the exposure triangle perfectly, you're not going to be as good as you could be. So it's very important that you don't rush yourself out of the technician phase. Spend a lot of time with the owner's manual of your camera and find out where all those different controls are and how to access them. And if you don't understand one of those controls, go to the internet and look up, what are focus modes, figure it out. And you'll be a better photographer in the long run once you really get this strong foundation as a technician in phase 1. In phase 2, I call it the craftsman. Now you know your camera really perfectly. You know all the ins and outs, the menus and all that stuff. Now you're actually applying all these technical things you learned to the real world. You're out there taking pictures, you're starting to use compositional rules, as in this image here, maybe the rule of thirds, or you're doing leading lines, diagonal lines, framing, visual weight, all that type of thing. So you're taking all those technical things you learned and you're applying them in a more artistic way. You're not quite the artist yet, though, so I like to call it the craftsman. So you're out there experimenting. Another important part of this phase is you're learning qualities of light. You're learning actually what light is. What is warm light? What is cool light? What is harsh light? What is soft light? And more importantly, you're learning how to control light. You're learning how to deal with harsh light, and you're learning, what to do, how to set up your camera, how to use certain compositional rules to deal with certain lighting conditions. So that's the very important part of the craftsman. Also, another thing a craftsman does is they're often doing exercises, photographic exercises. The little drip of water into a bowl. You're maybe doing double exposures or blurred movement. Now, this type of photography really is cliche. It's not going to make you famous, but it's an important part of your upbringing. This is something that you need to learn so that you could apply all those technical things in the real world. So it's very important that you do those photographic exercises. And at this stage, a lot of photographers will turn pro, and many make really good livings, even though they've never passed the craftsman phase. And that's nothing to be ashamed of. Craftsmen are very good photographers, and they could do portraits, they could do weddings, they could do a lot of really, money-making type photographic opportunities. The thing I should encourage everyone, or I want to encourage everyone, is that you really should aim past the craftsman phase, and you really should strive to be the artist, and that's phase 3. Now, the artist, they know everything about their camera, they know everything about composition, and so well that they probably couldn't explain it. They just come upon a scene and they know exactly what they want to do and how to do it. That's the important thing. And that's what the artist does. Another thing an artist could do is they'll come upon a scene and it might look drab and boring, but they could visualize in their mind's eye what the scene might look like if the lighting conditions were a little different, the weather was a little different. And this is important. The artist is relentless in that they'll come back to that scene over and over and over again until they get the light, weather, clouds, whatever. They get it exactly the way they want it. And there's stories of Ansel Adams going back to a spot for 10 years until he got the light exactly the way he wanted it. So that's important, and an important thing that the artist does. Another thing an artist could do is they could evoke emotion in their images. Their images get imbued with this sense of emotion. They know how to do this from all the things they learned as a technician and all the things they learned as a craftsman. They could come upon a scene, and if they say, just for example, want to show isolation and loneliness, they know what settings on their camera to use, what compositional rules to use or not use to imbue that scene in their image with that emotion of, let's say, loneliness and isolation. So a person viewing it will get those feelings. Now, I often say that when someone looks at my image, I don't want them to think about anything, I want them to feel. And that's what the artist is able to do. And finally, you'll find is if you become an artist, and I hope you all do, is that quite often you'll have a lot of enthusiastic followers, but you'll have probably an equal number of enthusiastic detractors. And I think that's mainly because that an artist will break those compositional rules if it allows them to imbue their image with what they want to imbue it with. So the artist doesn't care about compositional rules. They might not care about technical settings that would give them the optimum shot. They want to just capture the image with the vision they see for that scene. And I think this is a good example, like Vivian Maier, when her stuff was unearthed a few years ago, and it saw the light of day. There were many people that said she was a genius, but there probably were equal number of people that said, wow, what's so big about that? And I once had a talk with a photographer, a very accomplished photographer, and we were talking about Henri Cartier-Bresson, and he said to me, I don't see the big deal about Henri Cartier-Bresson. He took maybe 5 good images his entire life. And you're talking about the guy who's considered the grandfather of street photography. So that's what the artist has to deal with. And that's it. That's really what I wanted to talk about in this, the first episode of Photography is My Passion. It's these 3 phases of growth, and I hope that is interesting to you and get you thinking about what phase you're in and what you need to do to move on to the next phase. Now, next week in Photography is My Passion podcast, I think we'll talk about street photography. One of my more popular workshops is on street photography. Now, I won't have time to do the entire workshop in the podcast, but we'll do a little abbreviated version of it next week. So look for that. All right. That's it. I'll talk to you guys soon.